I've been in need of a cold frame. Spring is coming. I need to get my plants started for the vegetable garden. I'd like to have something that's on wheels so I can wheel it inside at night. I'll make a sturdy frame and a floor and 4 sides and a rail and stile roof with plexiglass panels. And I'd like it to hinge at the bottom so the top opens so I can vent heat out when it gets too hot. I'll start by making the frame for the floor. That'll just be out of 2x4s. I started by jointing and planing these, and then I cut them to a rough length. And I decided I'd do a lap joint at the corners, so I cut off half the thickness at the ends of each piece with my dado blade on the radial arm saw. And this gave me a lap joint, which is quite strong. I laid them out and made sure they were square and clamped them in place. Then I could add 2 screws at each corner and put the floor on, which is a piece of 3/4 inch plywood to make it very rigid. And then from this I can build the rest of the cold frame on top of this structure. Once I had it together, I could trim it down to even up the sides. I find in woodworking it's a lot of adding pieces together and then subtracting off the extra, or truing the parts that you've put together to be flush. I then could start making the side panels. And I started with the ends that have the angle on the top. So once I figured this angle out, I could cut my 2 end panels. And I just carefully used my miter gauge to make that cut. I wanted to put a piece of trim at the top of the sides to cover up the end of the plywood. And this would also help in making all 4 sides be flush at the top. So I made some 3/4 inch square trim. I attached that to the 2 end pieces, and I didn't worry about the length because I'll trim it all flush and to the final width that I need. Now we'll make the 2 long sides, which are just rectangles, and I'll leave them a little bit wide at this point. I'll get some trim ready. Now the trim I'd like to also have the angle of the sides so that it's all flush on the top. So I need to cut that angle into the piece of trim that's going along the long sides of the cold frame. I also needed to make a spot for the hinge for the roof. I like to at least put the pieces next to each other so I can make sure my angles and my faces are correct. So I'm not attaching things in the wrong way. And we have no air. Turn the compressor on. Now we have air. Now I'll put the trim on the tall side. I can cut the 2 long sides to the right length now and trim off the piece of trim so it's flush. I can cut the 2 long sides to the correct height. In doing it this way, I didn't have to worry about the trim being the right height. I could just worry about the angle on these pieces and then get the height right once the trim was on. And I could line up the different pieces with each other. Now I can put all the pieces together. I thought about using blocking in the corners to hold the corners together better, but I decided I had a rigid enough base and I was putting 3/4 inch plywood together. That would have enough thickness in the corners to be able to make a strong enough connection at each corner. So I just used glue and nails. This is a time lapse of putting the sides together. Now for the plexiglass top, I have some salvaged plexiglass that I want to use for the top. I'll make a rail and stile system where the panels will be the plexiglass. So I'll cut some strips out of poplar. And cut them to a rough length. And plane them so they're all an even thickness. I can use the plexiglass to figure out how long to make the rails. So the plexiglass plus a little spacer, if I put my stop in place, I can then cut all of the rails to the same length. Along the rail and stile, I need to cut a dado on one side to hold the plexiglass. and to make the joint between the rail and the stile. Now I'll make the tenon at the end of the rails that'll fit into that dado on the stiles and help make that a strong joint. I'll glue everything together. I'll put glue on that tenon and then push the tenon into that dado. And then before I put the other stile on, I'll put the plexiglass in and glue it all together. And I'll check it for square. It seems to be pretty good. And the roof panel is together. Now I need to cut it to fit the box. I'd like to cut that angle that it's going to sit at on each side, so I still have the table saw set up with that angle in it. And I can cut it to the right length. I spent a lot of care getting the hinges in exactly the right spot, and then they ended up not working in that spot. And I had to move them closer to the inside of the box from where they are here, because I didn't have enough material on the roof when the hinges were in that location, so that the screws weren't going into very much. They did end up working. Now I had left the roof just a little bit long so I could flush trim the ends and get them to be flush with the box. I wanted to add a heat actuated opener for the roof so that if it gets too hot inside the box, the roof will open and let the heat out. So I started this process at this point. The other thing I needed to do, and I had forgotten to do before I put the sides together, was to add some vent holes at the bottom along the front. It seemed like a good idea to let cool air in when the roof opens. Now it's time to paint everything, so I masked out the plexiglass on the roof. This masking went pretty fast once I got the hang of it. Then I took everything outside, painted, and I thought I could spray it quicker than I could do it by hand. I hadn't used my sprayer in a while, so it took some tuning to get it working. But once it worked, it went really fast. This is leftover paint from painting the shop and the house, so it's a little thicker than what should really be run through this sprayer. I got a little more texture than I wanted, but it worked. I made a mini shop. And after masking the roof and thinking I was going to spray that, I remembered I was going to paint it a different color. And I really didn't have a good way to hold it outside while I sprayed it, so I decided to just brush the paint on, which went really quickly with the masking in place. And the finish might actually have even been better by doing it with the brush. I'll add the wheels, which is just a matter of mounting the wheels and putting some bolts in, and I'll put the roof back on. And the last thing I needed to do was attach my heat actuated opener, and I think it's more for a greenhouse window, so I had to make some blocks of wood to get the angles right where it attached to the frame, and with a little trial and error I got it to work. Now it's time to take it out of the shop and take it inside. It's going to live on our back deck where we get a lot of sun, and fill it with plants. The first day I had it out was also our first really sunny day of the year, and I actually burned the plants a little more than I'd hoped. I had a few seedlings that had come up, and they got a little overdone. It's working too well. I realized after moving it around that it really needed some handles. I made a pattern for the handle, which was half the handle, and then in making the actual handle I could flip the pattern around so the handle is symmetrical. And I can cut out that pattern and sand and round over the edges and paint, and we're ready to put the handles on. So I can bring it inside and take it outside. Thanks for watching.